All right, so I guess I wanted to talk today about why I had this idea about talking about the concept of responsible data science. And if you've ever been to my office in Y Block, you'll see a poster of a research brief that I've put up there and scrawled the words, "This is what's wrong with data science" on it. And so I won't talk about that, but I'll be happy to share it with you individually if you like, mainly because I haven't bothered to redact the names of the authors. So how did we get to this point, which I have a degree in history as well as engineering and statistics. So I always like to look at things from a historical perspective and sort of trying to cram my thoughts into 10 minutes on how we got here. I sort of started looking at kind of the history of ethics and the notion of what the responsibility of scientists and science is in society. And I sort of making the sweeping generalization that sort of prior to the Second World War, really probably prior to the 20th century, science was not really a profession. It was a bit of a hobby, and it was a bit of a, like I said, it was a hobby. It wasn't really a profession. It wasn't really what we think of as science as an industry today. And it was really viewed as a bit of, this intellectual exercise, not a lot of practical applications in people's day-to-day life. But that really changes with the Second World War. And I want to point out from the obvious, the most obvious technological advances in the Second World War, we think of as, space travel and nuclear science and things like that. But really after the Second World War, and even some before then, there is this public perception that sort of, science's progress is good. Okay. The other reason I like to pick World War II as a pivotal point is World War II brought about two things that really are crucial to data science as a profession. That's the advent of modern computing and the idea of operations research and database decision making that really came out of the Second World War, which is why I have Deming Duran and Robert McNamara, who was, a very big proponent of this data-based approach to warfare that worked out really well in the end. And so this is the turning point where we really start seeing, and again, about this time, there's a paper by Karl Popper, or talk he gave, which, as he says in the beginning, was not his idea, but he talks about the responsibility of scientists. And he says that the idea of scientists having to be responsible arises the more science becomes applied to people's everyday lives. In the abstract, scientists who deal in very airy-fairy, I always like to use pure mathematicians, they don't really need to worry about the ethical implications of their work. But as science becomes more ingrained in our day-to-day lives and more of an influence on our day-to-day lives, we have what I like to call the data science problem, which is that data science is almost entirely obsessed with affecting people's everyday lives. The problem is, though, data scientists like to cling to this legacy idea that science is detached from these pedestrian concerns, mainly because science is good. All science is good. Scientists, therefore, because they do good things, are good people. Therefore, they make good decisions, and they don't really need to worry that much about the ethical impact of their works. Kate is leering at me. I'm sure Kate DeVitt is probably leering at me right now, telling me how wrong I am. But we sort of see this manifest most grievously, I suppose, in the phrase "move fast and break things," which is not a very good ethical framework for implementing responsible data science. So, which brings me to sort of what do I mean when I talk about responsible data science? The obvious thing that people would reach for is the idea of ethical considerations. But I like to think there are actually concerns beyond ethical considerations. Okay. But I also want to recognize that responsible, the word responsible is quite flexible. And the nice thing about it is it can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. And it will mean different things in different contexts. What is responsible behavior for a data science practitioner may not be the same as responsible practice or responsible behavior for an educator or a researcher. which I sort of beg the question of, well, are there broadly applicable standards of practice that we might be able to think about as a community to define what we mean by responsible practice? And I say we need to go beyond ethics. I'll again drastically oversimplifying. Ethical considerations in many cases are concerned with mitigating or reducing or eliminating harms. When we get to data science, that becomes a little bit tricky, because how are we going to measure the harm? And my other question then is, is it really, do we have responsibilities beyond just avoiding harm? And I think we do, because, like I said, ethical behavior is in a sense, it's a little bit of a cop-out. I say, oh, well, I followed the rules. We worked out some wonderful rules about ethical behavior. I ticked all these boxes. I did all the things. My conscience is clean. I think that can be a bit of a cop-out, because oftentimes there are concerns that go beyond just those ethical concerns that I think we ought to concern ourselves with. So broadly speaking, I think we need to talk about ethics. Ethics is a starting point, but we also need to talk about other things when we talk about what it means to be a good practitioner, a good educator, and a good researcher in those terms. So wrapping things up quickly here. The question of what is the appropriate role for a scientist and what are the responsibilities of a scientist in society is a very, if you start looking at it, it's a very broadly discussed and deeply divisive and controversial issue. But it's one that I think we all need to personally engage with, as well as professionally engage with. I like to think or believe that it is possible for us to obtain some sort of consensus on what we think it means to be a good data scientist. And by good, I mean responsible, and what those obligations are as practitioners. Like I said, there's a legacy sort of belief, I think it's called scientism or scientificism or something like that, which is sort of this belief in the goodness of science, and that, scientific practice and scientific dogma is good. So it's ethically, morally good because I use the scientific principles and scientific practices in decision making, therefore I have made good decisions. I think we need to move beyond that, because if anyone has ever worked with people knows it doesn't matter how scientific or well educated they are. It has no bearing on whether or not they're good, decent people. As you can tell, I'm a bit of a misanthrope. Which sort of begs this question: why do we actually really care about being responsible? Why can't we just sort of go on with the way we're going on? As somebody at dinner pointed out, Kate DeWitt, science is a faith-based exercise. And when it comes to faith, the only thing that makes it work is trust. We trust the scientific method and the ideals of science. And more importantly, people hopefully trust the authority of science. And I'm hoping, again, I keep citing Kate DeWitt. I hope she's going to say a lot more about this. And I'm sure she is going to say a lot more about this idea. But coming from the perspective of being a domain leader in the Center for Data Science of Government Systems, this is really a big issue for any sort of government agency or government system. Government only functions when people trust the government. It basically all falls apart if people don't believe the government. And if they don't believe what the government is telling them, then things go really badly, as I think we've seen this year. So I really think as data scientists, we have a duty to sort of preemptively avoid getting ourselves in situations that undermine public trust. And that goes beyond ethical considerations to what are good practices to make sure we don't undermine that. Because really, once we lose trust through things like clarity, transparency, and accountability, if we don't have the legitimacy as data scientists, we're basically traveling medicine show people. We're a snake oil salesman at that point. And we all know how that tends to end. So with that, I really am looking forward to hearing the contributions of the speakers today. It looks like we're going to have a lot of people much more interesting and intelligent than me on this topic speaking. So I am looking forward to learning and listening just like the rest of you. So welcome you. I'm glad you all showed up. This should be a really fascinating day. So.
Thanks, Gentry.